The way that realism gets discussed in gaming comes in 3 different flavors. Wow, look at how realistic it is.
And also added an AI system to it, so we have fish move out of the way when you get close to them.
And you're just XYZ, so it's unrealistic. The first is used primarily to describe graphic fidelity in video games. The second is the logic my DM uses to describe why I can't be cool while I'm playing a marshal in Dungeons & Dragons. The third is anything that can be justified because it is realistic. I'd like to explore why I think realism is a plague on gaming as a whole, using these 3 common ways that people refer to it, and then after, discuss what I think is a much better target worth striving for. Part 1. Graphical Fidelity. Ever since gaming evolved past just a few blocks on screen moving up and down to mimic tennis, graphics have served as a benchmark for quality. Massive jumps have been made in technology to allow for dynamic lighting of environments, fluid movement of characters, and so on. Most console generations marked massive jumps, like going from 8 to 16 to 32 to 64 bits, etc. The jump to 64 bits was such a big deal that Nintendo decided to name the Nintendo 64 console after it, and its 3D graphics capabilities. Each step felt like an upgrade over the last, as the artists that made the games had more freedom to express whatever they wanted in games. The desire to get closer and closer to reality has limits, unfortunately. So the graphics gravy train had to slow down eventually. The Xbox 360/PS3 era is where it came to a crawl. There were plenty of games from previous console generations that already met this realism plateau in my opinion, like Metroid Prime for the GameCube, but it took until about the Xbox 360/PS3 era for most games to catch up. That's when you were already getting muzzle flashes on guns in Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, jiggle physics on titties in Dead or Alive 4, and well-made facial animations in Half-Life 2. I don't want to say that these are the most important metrics, but I think they express the point that by 2005-ish, graphics were already quite realistic. So, when the next console came out years later and Call of Duty included realistic arm hair as a selling point in its advertisements.
Your character's arms are one of the most looked at visual elements. The arms in MW3 were beautiful at the time, but the new engine allows significantly increased texture resolution and exponentially higher poly count. This advancement in technology allows us to convey fine hairs, bruising, cuts, and even the dirt beneath the fingernails.
I became enlightened by a sudden realization. The graphics have never been the point. I realized that graphics have never really been a factor in what I considered to be my favorite games. At least not the realism aspect of it. Mario 64, Metroid Prime, and I'm sad to say, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, Paper Mario, The Thousand Year Door. I didn't play these games because they were accurate depictions of reality. I played Mario 64 because they let me jump around icy mountains and volcanoes. I played Metroid Prime because it let me shoot aliens, worms, and dragons with my laser hand cannon. I played these games because they were goofy and imaginative. I played Call of Duty because the nuke was such a compelling goal to strive for every game. And in general, I just played the games because they were fun. But how do you sell fun? It's so much more straightforward if you just sell people game look gooder and your snappy 1-minute showcase of all the pre-rendered cutscenes and doesn't show any real gameplay footage. This was a symptom of gaming companies not understanding why people played games. The graphics exist insofar as they contribute to gameplay. Old games couldn't make the world realistic enough to hide the primary path, while modern game devs struggle so much that they need yellow paint. It's not ubiquitous, but it's a funny example that you can point to as a shorthand. It is unfortunate that the executives demand these bombastic features for the sole purpose of being used by advertisers. But at the end of the day, their job is to sell a product. Misaligned incentives, yada yada, I already did a video on that. Everything's a subscription service. That is, spoiler alert. The quest for realism isn't one without consequences as well. I'm not just talking about wasted budget either. Let it be known that it was someone's job to animate horse balls in Red Dead 2. Horse balls jiggle physics. Horse balls scrunching up in response to the cold. So guys, did the realistic horse balls increase your enjoyment of the game? Was that an afternoon well spent by some poor soul on the animation team? I imagine they were probably also on horse shitting duty too. Do you think they did research beforehand? You know, kind of like how Mortal Kombat animators watch videos of real people get executed. Are you uncomfortable yet? Have we reached a suitable level of realism for you now? There are some things that really shouldn't be realistic. Some things that don't need to be realistic. And in Mortal Kombat's case, are definitely better off being completely unrealistic. A bit of what I'm trying to say is that gamers have been hoodwinked into thinking that realistic graphics make a good game. Unfortunately, the goodness of a game is not something that can be expressed so easily. A good game is fun. Whether that means it's got solid progression that makes it feel like you're constantly achieving things, it has an excellent story, it has memorable characters, the gameplay is dynamic and exciting, or what have you. You don't have to check all the boxes, but if you do a few of these things well enough, then you've usually got a good game. And the words of Reggie.
If it's not fun, why bother?
I'll talk more about that later. Part 2. You can't do that because it's unrealistic. Here's the TTRPG part of the video. I'm sure we've all heard some variation of this one before. The prevalence of this statement is something that typically comes up at low levels, since that's when casters haven't quite gotten their god powers to render most of the game irrelevant yet. These are where the challenges are still locked behind doors or slimy walls with hazardous waste pits nearby. Can you make the climb? Well, if I cast Fly... Well, what if I wanted to roll acrobatics to run across the surface of the water? Let's assume 5e. Between Bardic Inspiration and Guidance, I can roll over an impossible DC of 30. If forest lizards can do it, why can't I? Oh, that's right. Because it's unrealistic. You see what I mean? If you just have the magic that says you can do the thing, then there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You get to do the thing. But if you do what the genre suggests, you could potentially do, like use your skills in order to perform completely ridiculous feats, like swimming up waterfalls or something, suddenly we all need to put our realism caps on. That's right, it's dead horse beating time. Every tabletop RPG video is a casters versus marshals video if you squint hard enough. Take a peek at this chart for the Pathfinder skill, Swim. This is pretty much the entire skill. Roll this number to swim, at a heavily reduced speed, of course. If the DC increases by 5 each step up, what is DC 25? Maybe a superstorm, like a hurricane or something. DC 30? Maybe like a whirlpool? How high do we have to go before you would say something like you can swim up a waterfall? DC 40? You can reach that pretty easily by taking the skill as a strength-based character with a racial swim speed. At level 5 with plus 4 strength, you could get a plus 20 bonus to reach that threshold. If we extrapolate this, then we could reasonably conclude that someone with a plus 50 swim bonus can probably swim through just about anything. Typhoons, tsunamis, quicksand, etc. Nah, that's too unrealistic. This ring, though, it's much more realistic if you just use teleportation. Or maybe if you could transform into a water elemental or something. A guy so built he can swim through dirt isn't nearly as realistic as a magical being made of water. You get what I'm saying, right? Why would the game reward you for being a master in a particular skill when you can just cast the spell that does the thing much easier? This is why the devs stopped at DC 20 to swim in stormy weather, but gave you the ring to teleport through hundreds of feet of water as a goddamn swift action of all things. For a game that encourages creative interpretation of the rules, I sure find myself on the receiving end of a lot of wet blankets for my ideas that don't involve magically solving my problems. I'm not asking for much. Just let me do cool shit. But the specter of realism is a double standard. People want things to be realistic, but only in certain ways. Somehow our game of rainbows and unicorns has to adhere to the same physical limitations of humans IRL on Earth. Things only need to be as realistic as it takes to not completely alienate players. As long as fire melts ice, gravity pulls down, and the moons still orbit planets, then we're good. We don't need to nickel and dime our Marshall boys for trying to do cool shit like shield surfing while shooting orcs. You know, the Gambit system in Knickknacks is actually a pretty good way to give your players excuses to try reckless shit for memes if you wanna, check it out. Part 3. Justifying things with realism. AKA the motion blur argument, or the advanced shaders, or the shadow quality, or the bloom. This is definitely related to the first two, but I think it's unique. These aren't just superfluous additions, but they actively make the game worse. That's right. Ray tracing makes the games you play worse. If you have to sacrifice a playable, consistent frame rate for more realistic lighting, then I will trade your shitty buzzword away every single time. Also consider just how ridiculous the cost to make games is. Hundreds of millions of dollars are spent on running the most advanced software on the most advanced hardware, always pushing the limits. To justify what? Buying a PS5 Pro? I think that everybody should look at something like the PS5 Pro as an insult to their intelligence. I also mean the human cost, too. It has become the norm for studios to overwork staff to meet absurd deadlines, then jettison them when their overworked asses made an unfinished mess. If realism is the excuse to justify these ridiculous costs, then I want shorter games with worse graphics made by people who are paid more to work less. Consider the following. Old school RuneScape has shitty graphics by modern standards. It has purposefully maintained its 2007 aesthetic for quite some time now. There's an interesting plugin that is popular enough to pop up in several YouTube videos where all it does is smooth over animations in the game to make it look more realistic. I think you know where we're going with this one. It does this the same way modern TVs make everything you watch look shittier, by adding in-between frames. A fundamental part of animation is keyframes, where most of the action happens. In-between frames are absolutely necessary in order to connect the keyframes together, but by just adding more of them, it doesn't make things more realistic. All you do is muddy the keyframes. You make the motion more fluid, but you also make it more unnatural. If you cheer in real life, you fling your arms forward quickly. They linger in place, and then you drag them backwards slowly. With the smoother animations, it all melds together. This is true for nearly every animation in RuneScape. They were boiled down to their base components because those were the most important action frames for you swinging your pickaxe at a rock or your sword at a monster. This particular example in RuneScape might not cost money, but it does cost me sanity every time I watch a video where people use it. And, as I mentioned, the same technology is making its way into modern overpriced TVs, so the point still stands. It's even worse for the TVs because the in-between frames are all blurry messes. The point of all of it is, realism is not the end-all be-all to an enjoyable experience. Consider animation as a medium and how it has delivered us some of the most incredible and popular shows ever, despite including odd elements like yellow people with skin hair in The Simpsons, or massively oversized and mispositioned eyes in Clanad. You get these silly, exaggerated parts of shows where characters are hyper-unrealistic in order to convey the extremes of emotion like happiness, anger, or fear. If adherence to realism was the defining factor that made things great, then we wouldn't even have fantasy as a genre, let alone fantasy role-playing games that let us fight dragons and cast magic. Realism, like any other aspect of art, is a tool whose usefulness waxes and wanes depending on the vibe you're going for. If you want to create an epic fantasy adventure, then making sure that swimming is as close to real life as possible shouldn't be something that crosses your mind for your player who is playing something that is beyond what an Olympic athlete is capable of. If you want to make a fun action shooter game, you're better off giving everybody lasers and jetpacks and making them all feel fun, interactive, and different, like with Overwatch. At least it was cool when it first came out. The tools should be used in order to achieve a particular feeling. You've heard it plenty of times, the really feel like Batman effect. It's cheesy and it's overdone, but it's important. For Doom, that means being a one-man army, so you kill dudes so hard you fuse their skulls with their shoulders. For Undertale, you want zany creatures, so Burger Pants gets these wild facial expressions. For D&D, you want interesting stories, so you should let your players do crazy things, even if it isn't entirely realistic. Now that you have been properly educated, go forth and enjoy worlds that aren't entirely realistic. What you're really looking for is immersion and internal consistency, anyway. You probably don't mind if giant demons and dragons wander around in Dark Souls, but in Nintendogs, it's a bit out of place. Dark Souls wants you to feel like a lowlife slowly ascending to godhood by slaying ever more powerful beasts, so these types of things fit right in. In worlds with magic and mayhem, you want trees that walk around and smash you with giant staves. It's probably a bad time to go on a Dark Souls spiel during a conclusion, but it's just a good example of a world filled with tons of weird shit that feels well realized enough that you don't question when weird things happen. Unrealistic things, no less. No. I say that it's unrealistic how often people casually die following down a flight of stairs when a dragon bite does far less damage. I say it's unrealistic that my horse regularly sends me careening off the cliff I so obviously ran away from. Curse you, horse! Hope you guys liked the video on Realism Bad. What bad next? Thanks for watching. If you'd like to hear me ramble about a specific topic, leave a comment, and I'll consider it for a future video. Subscribe if you want to see it. I love talking about game design in general, with a focus on tabletop role-playing games. I have links for Twitter, Blue Sky, Discord, and the Knickknacks official website in the description, so you can start playing right now. I regularly post some of my favorite content I've made on social media. But until next time, farewell, fellow gamers.